My dad told me to stay home for Christmas because I was too sensitive, saying it like a diagnosis instead of an insult, the way doctors deliver bad news they've delivered 100 times before with practiced detachment. He said it in the hallway while everyone else laughed in the living room, their voices blending into a wall of sound that made his words feel even sharper, more deliberate, more designed to cut. I stood there with my coat still on, keys digging into my palm hard enough to leave marks, realizing I'd already been written out of the day before it even arrived, before I'd even turned my car onto his street. The wreath on the door behind him suddenly looked mocking, all that forced cheer framing his indifferent expression like a portrait of everything wrong with this family, everything we pretended wasn't broken. I wanted to ask when he'd decided this, when the family meeting had happened without me, but the answer was probably weeks ago, shared with everyone except me in conversations I wasn't invited to join, decisions made about me without ever consulting me. He explained it would keep things calm, as if my presence alone caused problems that needed managing, as if I was a natural disaster everyone had to prepare for with emergency plans and evacuation routes. When I asked what I'd done, what specific transgression had earned this exclusion, he sighed that particular sigh, the one that said I was exhausting him just by existing, just by asking reasonable questions that any person would ask. He added that I always took things the wrong way, twisting innocent comments into attacks, making mountains out of molehills that no one else could even see or understand. That familiar tone made it clear the conversation was already over before it started, that he was simply informing me of a decision rather than discussing anything or allowing me input. He wasn't asking me to understand or agreeing to explain further. He was informing me of a decision the family had apparently already agreed upon in my absence, a verdict delivered without trial. I noticed he wouldn't meet my eyes, looking instead at a spot just past my shoulder, like I was already a memory he was trying to forget or erase completely from this day. I walked into the living room anyway, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack my face open, like my skin was too tight for the expression I was trying to create for their benefit. My cousins sat surrounded by torn wrapping paper and ribbons, their excitement filling the space I was supposedly threatening just by breathing the same air, just by existing in the same room. No one asked why I looked shaken, or why I'd been standing in the hallway for 10 minutes having what was clearly a difficult conversation that everyone had probably heard. They never did when it involved him, never questioned his version or wondered if there might be another side to the story he was telling. Uncle Mark glanced up briefly, then away, suddenly fascinated by his phone screen in that way people get when they want to avoid acknowledging awkwardness or taking any kind of stand. Aunt Carol offered me eggnog without quite looking at me, her hospitality automatic and empty, a reflex rather than genuine care or concern for how I was feeling. I perched on the edge of the couch, trying to shrink myself small enough to justify my existence in this room, to take up less space and cause fewer problems just by being present. This wasn't new territory for me or unfamiliar ground. Growing up, my dad had a habit of retelling moments until I sounded irrational and he sounded patient, a long-suffering father dealing with a difficult child who just couldn't get it together no matter how much help she received. By the time I defended myself, the room had already chosen sides based on his version, the one that painted him as reasonable and me as volatile, unstable, too emotional to be trusted with the truth. He'd describe conversations we'd had, changing key details just enough that my memory felt unreliable even to me, making me question what I knew to be true with absolute certainty. "That's not how it happened," I'd say, and he'd smile sadly, shaking his head like my denial proved his point perfectly, like my objection was exactly the kind of irrational response he'd been describing. The family would nod sympathetically. At him, never at me. And I'd feel myself disappearing a little more each time, becoming smaller and quieter until I barely existed at all in the family narrative, until I was just a problem to be managed. I learned to stay quiet over the years, thinking silence would make things easier for everyone, that if I just stopped pushing back the conflict would end and peace would be restored. Instead, it made his version the only one people remembered, the official family record that went unchallenged and unchecked, that became accepted truth through repetition. "She's emotional," he'd say when my name came up in conversation, and that single word was enough to dismiss anything I might have contributed or experienced or felt. No one asked what made me emotional or whether I had reason to be upset about the things that upset me, whether my reactions were proportional to what had actually happened. The label stuck like a scar, defining me in every family interaction before I even opened my mouth to speak, before anyone heard my side. I became the problem that needed accommodation, the volatile element that had to be carefully managed and contained for everyone's safety and comfort. My silence was taken as confirmation that he'd been right about me all along, that I was exactly as difficult and unreasonable as he'd always said, that my quietness proved I had nothing valid to contribute. Grandma noticed immediately when I walked in, her sharp eyes catching the tension in my shoulders, the tightness around my mouth. She always did, her sharp eyes catching details everyone else missed or ignored, because noticing would require them to do something uncomfortable, to take a stand or question the family's chosen narrative. She asked why I was hovering near the door like I was about to bolt, like a wild animal ready to flee at the first sign of danger or threat, her voice cutting through the general noise with surprising clarity that made several people turn their heads to listen. The room didn't exactly go quiet, but several conversations faltered and died mid-sentence as people realized something was happening. I opened my mouth to answer, scrambling for something that wouldn't sound accusatory or dramatic, that wouldn't make me seem like the problem he said I was, that wouldn't confirm every negative thing he'd ever said. Before I could form words that made sense, my dad jumped in with practiced ease, his voice warm and concerned in that way that made any contradiction seem cruel and ungrateful, like I was attacking someone who only had my best interests at heart. He said I was just overwhelmed by the crowd, by all the noise and activity, his hand gesturing vaguely as if my discomfort was obvious to everyone in the room who cared to look. Grandma narrowed her eyes, the way she did when she knew someone was lying but wanted to hear exactly how far they'd take it, how deep the deception would go before they admitted the truth. She didn't challenge him directly, not yet, but something in her posture shifted from casual to alert, from friendly to watchful and evaluating. She mentioned a letter she'd been expecting months ago, changing the subject so abruptly that several people looked confused, wondering what letters had to do with Christmas or my supposed overwhelm or anything currently happening. It was something important, she said, something personal that my dad had promised to mail for her back in August when the summer heat was still heavy and oppressive. She'd given it to him sealed and addressed, trusting him to handle something that mattered to her deeply, something she'd put real thought and care into creating. My dad froze for half a second too long before saying he didn't know what she meant, his confusion just slightly too performed, too deliberate, too careful. I watched him carefully reconstruct his expression into casual bewilderment, but Grandma had already seen what she needed, that tiny pause that revealed everything, that moment of calculation before the lie. Grandma insisted, her voice taking on that steel quality that meant she wouldn't be dismissed or distracted, that she was prepared to push this as far as it needed to go regardless of who got uncomfortable. She said it was handwritten, personal, and addressed to the whole family, something she'd worked on for weeks before finally sealing the envelope with a sense of completion. She'd been waiting for it because it explained why she'd stepped back from certain family decisions recently. Why she'd stopped hosting holidays and attending every gathering the way she used to for decades. The letter was supposed to clarify her reasons, to prevent exactly the kind of speculation and gossip that had filled the gap left by her silence and absence from family events. She looked directly at my dad as she spoke, and I saw something flicker across his face, not quite panic, but close, something like fear mixed with calculation and rapid problem-solving. He suggested she might be misremembering the timeline, his tone gentle in a way that felt dangerous, like he was trying to make her doubt herself the way he'd always made me doubt myself, the way he made everyone question their own perceptions. The room grew quiet in that uncomfortable way that happens when everyone senses conflict, but no one wants to acknowledge it openly, when people would rather pretend everything is fine. My dad tried to laugh it off, saying Grandma must be confused about the timing or mixing up different conversations from different months, maybe even different years. That word, confused, hung in the air like an accusation disguised as concern, like he was worried about her mental state rather than admitting any wrongdoing on his part. It was the same tactic he'd used on me for years, questioning someone's perception until they questioned it themselves, until reality became negotiable and truth became whatever he said it was. But Grandma didn't waver or back down or second-guess herself the way I always had. She said she'd written the letter in her own hand in her kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon while watching the rain streak down the windows, while thunder rumbled in the distance. She remembered because those kinds of details mattered when you were explaining something true, when you were establishing a timeline that couldn't be disputed or rewritten. Her certainty made the room feel smaller, the air thicker, like we were all holding our breath waiting to see what would happen next, what revelation was coming. My dad suggested they discuss it later, privately, as if Grandma's concerns were too delicate or embarrassing for public consumption, as if protecting the family meant hiding uncomfortable truths from view. But Grandma reached into her purse with deliberate slowness, pulling out an envelope that had clearly been opened and read multiple times, the creases soft from handling and refolding. She said it had finally arrived last week, tucked inside a stack of papers she'd found in my dad's study during a recent visit to help him organize files for tax season, a favor she'd offered out of kindness. She hadn't been snooping, she clarified, just trying to help him get ready for the accountant, trying to make his life easier. But there it was, months late, buried under bank statements and old receipts, like something he'd hoped would be forgotten entirely, like evidence he'd tried to hide. My name was written on the inside, she added, looking at me for the first time since this conversation started, her eyes finding mine across the room. The room seemed to stop breathing, everyone frozen in place waiting for what came next, for the bomb to detonate. My dad told her not to read it right now, his voice taking on a sharp edge that rarely surfaced in public, a tone usually reserved for private moments when no witnesses were present. He said Christmas wasn't the time for this kind of thing, that it would ruin the day for everyone who'd come here expecting celebration rather than conflict, rather than uncomfortable truths. That's when Grandma decided it was exactly the time, her jaw setting in that way that meant no amount of persuasion would move her from her chosen course of action. She unfolded the letter slowly, smoothing the creases with hands that had written 1,000 notes and cards over the years, hands that knew the weight of words and how to use them. My cousins exchanged glances, Uncle Mark put down his phone for the first time all morning, and Aunt Carol stopped pretending to fuss with the food on the table, her hands going still. Even the kids sensed something significant was happening, their usual chaos dampening into watchful silence as they picked up on the adults' tension, the charge in the air. I felt my heartbeat in my throat, pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it, thought it might give away how terrified I was of what came next. The letter started with an apology, Grandma read, for not speaking up sooner when speaking up might have made a difference, might have changed the trajectory of years. It acknowledged that staying silent had made things worse, had allowed patterns to continue unchecked and unchallenged for far too long, had enabled behavior that should have been stopped. Then it detailed conversations I remembered having with family members, specific words, specific moments that had been burned into my memory like brands. Times I'd expressed concerns or shared experiences that were later dismissed as misunderstandings or oversensitivity, as me taking things the wrong way again, as me being dramatic. The letter listed them methodically, like evidence being presented in court, each incident dated and described with careful precision that made them impossible to dismiss. Grandma had been watching, she'd written, and she'd started keeping notes when things stopped adding up, when the discrepancies became too frequent to ignore or explain away innocently. She'd seen how stories shifted depending on who was telling them, how my version was always the one that got erased or rewritten to make someone else look better. My hands started shaking, gripping the armrest until my knuckles went white and my fingers ached from the pressure, from holding on to something solid. The letter also explained why Grandma had started questioning my dad more directly over the past few years, asking pointed questions that made family dinners uncomfortable and tense. She'd noticed patterns in how he talked about me when I wasn't there, small exclusions from family plans that were explained away as being for my own good, or to avoid drama, or to keep things pleasant for everyone. She'd watched him reframe my reactions in conversations, adding emotional intensity that hadn't been there, making me sound unstable or difficult or completely unreasonable compared to everyone else. The letter described a specific incident from 2 Christmases ago when I'd left early, supposedly because I'd overreacted to a harmless joke someone made about my job, about my choices. Grandma had asked me about it later, privately, calling me on a quiet Tuesday evening when she knew I'd be home, and heard a completely different version. One where the joke hadn't been harmless at all, where it had been deliberate and cruel, and designed to humiliate me in front of people I cared about. She'd started noticing how often my dad's stories cast himself as patient and me as unreasonable, how the narrative always positioned him as the victim of my sensitivity, rather than someone who might be contributing to the problem. Grandma's voice remained steady as she read, but I could hear the slight tremor underneath, the emotion she was working hard to control for all our sakes. She explained in the letter that she'd tried to address things privately with my dad several times, suggesting he might be too hard on me sometimes, that maybe he was remembering things differently than they'd actually happened, that memory is unreliable. He dismissed her concerns with the same gentle condescension he used on me, assuring her she was seeing problems that weren't there, that she was being influenced by my distorted version of events, by my oversensitivity. But she'd kept watching, kept comparing what she witnessed directly with what was reported later in family conversations, what became the official story. The discrepancies piled up like snow, small individually but eventually impossible to ignore or explain away as innocent mistakes. She wrote that she'd finally confronted him about the pattern 6 months ago, laying out specific examples with dates and witnesses, which was why she'd stepped back from family events since summer, why she'd been noticeably absent. She couldn't keep participating in something that felt fundamentally dishonest, that required her to pretend she didn't see what was happening right in front of her, that demanded her complicity in something wrong. My dad tried to interrupt, standing up abruptly and saying the letter was taken out of context, that Grandma didn't understand the full picture of what it was like dealing with me year after year, managing my emotions. Grandma told him to stop talking, her voice cutting through his protest with unexpected force that made him actually close his mouth mid-sentence, mid-justification. No one had ever said that to him before. At least not in front of the whole family, where his authority could be witnessed crumbling, where his control could be seen slipping. The power dynamic that had structured every family gathering for decades shifted visibly in that moment, the foundation cracking loud enough for everyone to hear, impossible to ignore. He sat back down slowly, his face flushed with something between anger and embarrassment, his hands gripping his knees hard enough that I could see his knuckles whiten. Aunt Carol looked like she might intervene but seemed frozen, unable to choose sides in a conflict that was rewriting family history in real time, that was dismantling everything we'd all agreed to believe about ourselves. Uncle Mark cleared his throat but said nothing, his usual jokes and deflections suddenly inappropriate, suddenly useless. The silence felt enormous, pressing down on all of us like atmospheric pressure before a storm heavy and inescapable. For the first time in my adult life, relatives started looking at me differently, not with pity or that careful concern reserved for fragile people who might break at any moment if handled too roughly. They looked at me with something closer to confusion, like they were seeing me clearly for the first time and realizing I didn't match the description they'd been given, the character they'd been told I was. They were realizing there had been another version of the family dynamic they'd never been shown, a narrative running parallel to the one they'd accepted without question for years, maybe decades. My cousin Jessica, who'd always been friendly but distant, careful to maintain exactly the right amount of connection without getting too close, met my eyes with what looked like recognition or maybe regret, maybe guilt. Uncle Mark shifted uncomfortably in his chair, probably remembering times he'd agreed with my dad's assessment of me without question, times he'd laughed at jokes made at my expense, times he'd dismissed my concerns. Even the younger cousins seemed uncertain, picking up on the adults' discomfort even if they didn't understand the details or the history, even if they couldn't follow all the implications. The room felt different, the familiar space suddenly strange and unsteady, like the floor had shifted beneath us without warning. I sat very still, afraid to move and break whatever was happening, afraid this moment would evaporate if I drew attention to myself, if I reminded everyone I was here. I didn't feel victorious watching my dad's carefully constructed narrative crack open like ice in spring, like something that had seemed solid revealing itself as fragile. I felt tired, the kind of exhaustion that lives in your bones after years of fighting battles no one else could see or acknowledge, battles people told you weren't happening. Years of being dismissed don't disappear, because one truth comes out in one conversation on one Christmas morning in front of witnesses. The validation I'd craved for so long arrived hollow, accompanied by the painful awareness of how much had been lost to his version of events, how many years I'd spent doubting my own perceptions, my own sanity. I thought about all the family moments I'd missed or endured in silence, all the relationships that might have been different if people had questioned his story sooner, if anyone had bothered to ask for my side before deciding. The anger I expected didn't come rushing in to fill the space left by years of hurt. Instead, I felt a strange, distant grief for the family we might have been if honesty had mattered more than comfort, if truth had been valued over maintaining pleasant appearances, over keeping things calm. The vindication felt less like victory, and more like a funeral for something that had never actually existed, for a family I'd imagined we could be. Grandma folded the letter carefully, smoothing it against her lap with movements that suggested ritual, something practiced and significant that she'd prepared for, that she'd been building toward. She said she believed me, looking directly at me when she spoke, holding my gaze in a way that felt like an anchor, like solid ground. She said it calmly, without drama or theatrical emphasis, just a simple statement of fact that landed with more weight than any passionate declaration could have carried, that meant more because of its simplicity. That mattered more than anything else that day, more than my dad's discomfort or the family's confusion or the vindication I'd thought I wanted for so many years, that I'd dreamed about. Someone I respected, someone whose opinion had always mattered in this family, someone people listened to, had looked at the evidence and chosen to trust my reality over the comfortable fiction everyone else preferred, the story that made everyone else feel better. Her belief didn't undo the damage that had accumulated over decades, didn't erase years of pain, but it created a foothold, a place from which reconstruction might be possible if I wanted to try, if I had the energy. I managed to nod, not trusting my voice enough to speak without breaking completely, without letting out years of held breath and swallowed words, without crying in front of everyone. My dad stood up and announced he was going for a walk, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion, vibrating with anger he couldn't express without revealing himself further. He didn't ask anyone to join him, and notably, tellingly, no one offered to accompany him into the cold December air. That itself was remarkable. Usually someone would have followed to make sure he was okay, to smooth things over, to hear his side and offer comfort and reassurance that he wasn't the bad guy. This time, the family let him leave alone, watching him grab his coat from the closet and close the door with more force than necessary, the sound echoing through the suddenly quiet house like a final statement. The silence he left behind felt heavier than his presence ever had, thick with questions people were only beginning to formulate, realizations that were just starting to form in minds that had never questioned before. I heard someone exhale slowly, releasing tension they'd been holding since Grandma pulled out that envelope, since this whole thing started. The Christmas tree lights blinked steadily, indifferent to the small earthquake that had just reshaped the room's emotional landscape, that had rearranged the family's understanding of itself and its history. Nobody moved to go after him, and that absence of movement spoke louder than anything that had been said, louder than any of Grandma's words. Dinner went on, awkward but honest in a way family gatherings rarely are, stripped of the usual pretense and performance we all maintained. People asked me questions, and actually waited for the answers instead of talking over me or changing the subject halfway through my response, instead of interrupting to tell their own stories. Aunt Carol wanted to know about my job, details beyond the brief updates I usually offered before being interrupted or dismissed as boring or irrelevant. Jessica asked about my apartment, a place none of them had visited despite my living there for 3 years, despite multiple invitations they'd all declined with various excuses. The conversations felt tentative, like everyone was learning a new language, trying out words they'd never used before in my presence, testing what was allowed. I answered carefully, testing whether this new attention would last or evaporate once the shock wore off and old patterns reasserted themselves, whether this was genuine or just guilt. The food tasted different somehow, or maybe I was just paying attention for the first time in years, actually present instead of just enduring, instead of counting minutes until I could leave. The awkwardness felt cleaner than false comfort, more respectful than pretending nothing had changed when everything had shifted fundamentally, when the ground had moved. Someone asked if I wanted more potatoes and actually waited for my answer, actually cared what I said. Later, after dessert, my aunt pulled me aside into the kitchen where we could talk quietly, away from the others. She admitted she'd always wondered why I was treated differently, why my dad's descriptions of me never quite matched the person she saw during brief interactions at holidays and birthdays, why the stories didn't align. She said she regretted not speaking up sooner, not questioning the narrative when small inconsistencies appeared that should have raised red flags, that should have made her ask questions. I told her I understood, even if part of me didn't, even if part of me wanted to ask why it took Grandma's letter to make people see what had been happening in plain sight for years, what had been obvious. But I also understood how easy it is to believe someone you trust. Especially someone as confident and convincing as my dad, someone who told stories well. I understood how family dynamics create their own gravity that's hard to resist, how challenging the accepted version requires courage most people don't have, how it's easier to go along. She looked genuinely troubled, her eyes wet with tears she was trying not to shed, which was more than I'd expected from someone who'd been a bystander for so long, who'd watched and done nothing. I appreciated her admission, even as I recognized it couldn't change the past or give me back the years I'd lost to his narrative. She squeezed my shoulder briefly before walking away, and it felt like a beginning of something, though I wasn't sure what, though I didn't know if it would last. That night, after most people had left and the house felt emptier, quieter, Grandma sat next to me on the couch in the dim light. She squeezed my hand with surprising strength for someone her age, her skin paper-thin but her grip certain and steady, reassuring. She said sensitivity wasn't a flaw, though I'd been taught to treat it as one, though I'd spent years trying to sand it down into something more acceptable to everyone else. It was just inconvenient for people who didn't want to be questioned, who preferred surfaces to depth, who needed their version of reality to remain unchallenged and comfortable, who didn't want to look too closely. She said she'd raised my dad to be better than this, and his failures were his own to carry, not mine to compensate for or apologize for endlessly. The words settled something in me that had been anxious and untethered for years, something that had never found solid ground or a place to rest. I leaned against her shoulder, breathing in her familiar scent of lavender and old books, and we sat like that while the Christmas lights blinked their patient rhythm outside. She didn't need me to say anything, didn't require gratitude or reassurance or explanation. She just sat with me in the quiet, and it was enough, more than I'd had in years. My dad never apologized, not that day or in the months that followed when the dust settled and life continued. Instead, he became quieter in family settings, less confident in controlling the narrative that had always centered him as the reasonable one, the patient one, the victim. The shift was subtle but real. He still talked, still offered opinions, but something had changed in how people received them, in whether they accepted his version without question or pushback. Family members started fact-checking his stories against other sources, asking me directly about events he referenced instead of just accepting his interpretation as gospel truth. He noticed. I could tell from the way his jaw tightened when someone politely questioned his account of something, when someone said, "That's not how I remember it." But he never acknowledged the change out loud, never admitted that his authority had been diminished, that his power had been reduced. His influence diminished not through confrontation but through erosion, people's trust wearing away like stone underwater, slowly but inevitably, impossible to stop. I watched it happen with complicated feelings, neither triumphant nor particularly sympathetic, mostly just tired of it all. Mostly, I felt relieved that the weight of proof had finally shifted off my shoulders, that I no longer had to convince anyone of my own sanity or worth. I stopped trying to prove myself after that Christmas, stopped collecting evidence of my own sanity and reliability like I was preparing for trial, like I needed documentation. The people who mattered had finally seen enough to question the official story, to wonder if maybe there had been another truth running underneath all along. The rest didn't need convincing because they'd never really been listening anyway, never cared enough to look beyond the surface explanation, never wanted to know. I let go of relationships that had only existed on the condition of my silence, and surprisingly I didn't miss them as much as I'd feared I would, as much as I'd thought I needed them. What remained felt more solid, built on something closer to truth, even if that truth was uncomfortable and complicated, even if it meant fewer people. I started saying no to family events that felt obligatory rather than genuine, and the sky didn't fall the way I'd always feared it would, the way I'd been taught it would. My dad's disapproval, which had once felt crushing and absolute, became just another opinion I didn't have to accept or internalize, just noise. The freedom was disorienting at first, all that space where anxiety used to live, where I used to spend so much energy managing everyone's perception of me, trying to control damage. I had to learn how to fill that space with something other than fear, something other than constantly defending myself. The letter didn't fix our family or erase decades of dysfunction and misunderstanding and deliberate deception, didn't make us suddenly functional. But it changed where I stood in it, shifted my position from scapegoat to person with a legitimate perspective that deserved consideration and respect. I wasn't the problem anymore, the source of tension that needed managing or the volatile element that had to be contained and controlled. I was just someone who'd finally been heard after years of speaking into silence, after years of being told my voice didn't matter, that I was wrong. Grandma's willingness to document what she'd witnessed gave me something I'd been missing: corroboration, proof that I hadn't imagined or exaggerated the dynamics that had shaped my entire life, that had defined me. The family would never be what I'd once hoped it could be, would never transform into the warm, accepting unit I'd wanted as a child, that I'd seen in other families. But I no longer needed it to be, no longer required their validation to know my own worth or trust my own perceptions. I had my own version of events now, validated and real and documented in Grandma's careful handwriting, and that was enough. I could finally stop fighting to be believed and start living like someone who believed herself, who trusted her own mind, who knew her own truth.